Hello, students. Today we will be reading a text titled The Celestials Railroad by Bruce Watson. This selection is in your My Book on pages 268 through 274. You may want to grab your copy and follow along and annotate inside of it as I read the selection. Remember, you're going to be starting on page 268. The type of genre of this magazine is a magazine article. A magazine article gives information about a topic, person, or event. Magazine articles may represent ideas in chronological order to help readers understand what happened and when. Articles related to social studies may include words that are specific to a topic. Magazine articles include text features such as captions and sidebars, which give additional information about a topic. Think about the title and genre of the text. What do you know about working on railroads? And what do you want to learn? Pause now and answer these questions in your My Book, in the blank bubble on page 268, or in your reading journal. When you're finished, come back and press play. Okay, now that you've answered these questions, I want you to take a look for a moment at the pictures and read the captions in the story. You can pause the video now, flip through the pages, and take a look at the pictures and also the captions underneath the pictures. Okay, did you look at the pictures? I hope you did. Now that you've looked at the pictures and you've read through some of the captions of the story, and you've seen the title and know the genre of the text, what do you think this selection will be about? What will you learn from reading it? Answer these questions in your My Notes space on page 269 of your My Book. Pause so that you can do this now. Welcome back. In this informational text, you will learn all about the Chinese workers who helped to build the first transcontinental railroad. Throughout other lessons, you will apply your understanding of genre, main idea, and details that help support the main idea. Okay. I'm going to start reading on page 270. 2 decades after pioneers began migrating to the Wild West, the U.S. government in 1861 agreed to the construction of a transcontinental railroad system that would link California with the rail network of the eastern United States. On the Utah prairie, where 1,000 workers had gathered for the ceremony. 4 Chinese men carried an iron rail toward the rack. It was the last link in the railroad that within moments would span the continent. The date was May 10, 1869. The Union Pacific locomotive stood to one side and the Central Pacific to the other. As I read, I monitor or check myself to make sure I understand what I'm reading. If I don't, then I reread to clarify anything I do not understand. For example, I paused after reading the first paragraph and asked myself if I understand all the details. I don't understand what the Union Pacific or Central Pacific are. So, the first time I read this, I reread and clarified that they're locomotives. I know that the workers are building a railroad, so a locomotive must be a train. I'll read on to continue to monitor and clarify this point. All right, continuing on page 270. Because they called China the Celestial Kingdom, the Chinese workers were known as Celestials. Few of their fellow railroad workers bothered to learn their names. No one knows their names to this day. But it was on the backs of these Chinese workers that the first transcontinental railroad was built. For the Chinese, the work began as an experiment. Many Chinese men had to come to America during the first California gold rush. When they did not strike it rich in the gold fields, they sought other work, but faced discrimination instead. Then, in 1863, Central Pacific and Union Pacific Railroad tycoons agreed to build a coast-to-coast link. The Union Pacific would head west from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific would extend east from Sacramento, California. The two companies mapped out routes, raised money, and hired the workers. Within a year, the Union Pacific was well into Nebraska, but the Central Pacific had bogged down at the edge of the Sierra Nevada mountains. In California, most men were busy searching for gold or silver. To complete his railroad contract, railroad magnate Charles Crocker needed help. Over the protests of his workers, Crocker turned to the Chinese. In February 1865, 50 Chinese men were transported by flat car to the rail's end in the Sierra foothills. While other workers jeered and threatened to strike, the Chinese calmly set up camp, boiled rice provided by the company, and went to sleep. Up at dawn, with picks and shovels in hand, they worked 12 hours straight without complaint. By sundown, Crocker had telegraphed his office in Sacramento, "Send more Chinese." Within a few months, 3,000 Chinese were pushing the Central Pacific eastward. By the end of 1865, more than 6,000 Chinese were working on the railroad. How were the Chinese men treated when they arrived at a work site? Well, as we can see from the text, they were treated pretty badly by the other workers. How did the Chinese men react? Well, it says here in the text that they ignored the other workers and just set up their camp, cooked their food, and went to bed. Why did all the other workers threaten to strike? They may have worried that the Chinese workers were going to take their jobs. Let's continue reading and find out some more information. As the Central Pacific roared toward Donner Summit at the top of the Sierras, the Chinese took jobs no one else would touch. They hung from ropes draped over the edges of cliffs and tapped holes into the sides of mountains. After inserting dynamite, they jerked the ropes and were yanked upward. If they were lucky, they cleared the explosion and lived to tap more holes. If not, they fell into the gorge below. Chinese workers blasted tunnels with nitroglycerin when other workers would not touch the explosive liquid. They graded hillsides, they chopped trees, they carried dirt in wheelbarrows, filled huge gorges with it, leveled it, and laid railroad ties evenly across it. Other workers then laid the iron railroads and hammered them down while the Chinese went ahead and prepared the next mile. Most other workers ate stale meat and drank brackish water. Because the Chinese paid for their own food, they were allowed to choose their food. They chose things that were familiar to them, such as oysters, cuttlefish, vegetables, rice, and tea. Crossing Donner Summit at 7,000 feet, many other workers took sick or quit, but the Chinese kept going. Mobs of white workers tormented the Chinese at every camp along the way. But across Nevada and into Utah, the Central Pacific inched towards the Union Pacific. And on April 27, 1869, Central Pacific crews, by then 90% Chinese, laid 10 miles of track in a single day, a new record. By the time the two railroads met at Montgomery, Utah, the Central Pacific employed 12,000 Chinese workers. Together with the Union Pacific crews, they watched as railroad tycoons drove in their golden spikes. But when cameras recorded the event, the Chinese workers were left out of the picture. On May 10, 1865, the single word "done" was telegraphed across the continent. Finished with their monumental task, the Chinese rowed the Central Pacific back across the track they had laid. Some went back to Chinatown, communities in Sacramento, San Francisco, and other cities. Others went to Canada, where they helped build the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Or worked on routes in California. Many spread out across the West, finding work or staking claims in mining towns such as Deadwood, South Dakota, and Tombstone, Arizona. Their labor and sacrifice had connected the east and west coasts of the growing nation. Come one, come all. The Chinese were unique in America's westward expansion because they were one of the few immigrant groups that did not come to settle permanently. Drawn for many of the same reasons as Americans who were looking for a better life or religious freedoms, immigrant groups from around the world established small communities throughout the West. Most of the Chinese, however, were men who had left their families behind in China. Their intention was to work hard, save their money, and return to their homeland. All right, thank you for joining me today for our read aloud. That was Celestial's Railroad. Have a great day.